Good evening, everyone, and welcome to True Encounters. I'm your host, Marvin Allen. Before I get into this encounter, I would like to apologize to all the listeners because I haven't been uploading any new material, which I do have. But like I said before, my laptop is broke and I've been doing it off of my phone, and I've been having trouble with that. So tonight I'm gonna bring you this new encounter. So without further ado, let's get started. Um, well, this encounter right here, it happened in the South, and this young lady, whose name is Carla, is originally from Pennsylvania. So one summer, she went to go stay with her grandparents. So her mother took her down there, dropped her off, talked to her parents for a few, then she headed back up the road before it got late. So her daughter said when she first got there, after her mother left, she was in a hurry to go in and go out. But her grandmother said, "No, wait a minute, I'm gonna fix you something to eat and then you can go out." So her grandmother made her something to eat, and after she ate, she asked her grandmother if she wanted her to do anything before she go outside. Grandmother said, "No, go out, don't go far, stay on the property, and don't be out there real late." So the granddaughter, she went outside. Now out back, the grandfather had built a play area down at the almost about 15 feet before you hit the tree line. He built a play area down there for the grandkids. So she went down there, and down there it's like a small bench where she could sit at. So she said she go down there and sit on this bench. And she said while she was sitting on the bench, about 5 feet from right there, it's like a little sand pit area where, the grandkids can play in the sand and build like little sand castles and stuff like that. So she said she's sitting right there on the bench. So as she's sitting on the bench, just looking around, she said something had threw a rock and it landed in the sand pit area. So she looked around, to see if she could see anything or anybody, but she don't see nothing. So she brushes off, don't pay it no attention. So after a few more minutes go by, another rock comes over there and it lands in the sand pit area. So she gets up, walk to her left into the opening, and she looks. She looks up in the tree line to see if she could see who or what threw the rock. So she walks around a little bit out in the open, but she don't see nothing. So she goes back over and sit on the bench again. So she said after about 2 to 3 more minutes go by, she said another rock goes over there and it lands in the sand area again. And she yells out, "I hope whoever throwing rocks out there, I wish y'all would stop. Y'all don't belong on my grandparents' property anyway." So she gets up, she walks back to the left to the opening again. When she gets over there to the opening, she looks up in the tree line again. And when she looks up in the tree line, she said she could see something standing behind this tree. She said it's a dark figure standing behind this tree. So she walks a little bit more to the left. And then she looks over there. She said this thing steps from behind the tree on 2 feet. She said that this thing looked like a black wolf standing up bipedal on 2 feet. She said it had the head of a dove. She said she could see the pointed ears. She said this thing had very long arms. Looked like they was too long for its body. She said this thing had what you would call like hair over the shoulders, like a lion would have. She said it had that. She said it had the legs like a dog. She said they was bent back. Now she said she looking at this thing, and this thing is looking at her. So she said she starts to walk backwards, and when she walks backwards, she said this thing walks to the right of it, over to where this little small trail at. She said, and when this thing get over to this little small trail, she said this thing stopped. She said, and when the thing stopped right there, it started to walk out of the trail and out of the tree line, down in their backyard. So she backs up. She's walking backwards. Now, in their backyard, the grandfather had built like this stand where they could keep like snacks and stuff in there, and ice and stuff like that. So she walks backwards up there and she stands by this thing. So she said this thing walks out. And when it walks over there by the little play area and stands right there by the sand pit area. And she said this thing's standing there. She said, so she backs up, turns around, looking to where she going at, and she steps on their back porch, because they had a back porch out back. So she steps up on the back porch, and she stands right there by the back door. She still has her back facing towards the house. So this thing just standing there, and it's just looking at her. She said then this thing started to make this low growl. So she said this thing made this low growl. She said she turned around, opened up the door, and she went in the house. She goes in the house, runs straight upstairs in the back room, because that's where she sleep at. She looks out the window. She said this thing was still standing there. She said then this thing started to walk. She said this thing walked over there by the little stand that the grandfather had built where they keep the little snacks and stuff in there during the summertime. She said when this thing got over there to where that stand was at, said this thing started to sniff. Said he put his head up in the air and it started to sniff. She said then this thing turned around, dropped down on all fours, and this thing ran up in the woods. Ran back up in the tree line. She said this thing was fast on all fours. So she said after this thing got up in the tree line, it ran straight down the little trail. She said so she go downstairs and she asked her grandmother. She said, "Grandma, do y'all have any kind of wild animals on this property?" So she said, "No. You might see, little coyotes or a fox every now and then, and deers and stuff like that." So she said, "Why?" She said, "Never mind." Now, mind you, she didn't tell her grandparents on what she saw. So nothing else happened later that, for the rest of that day. So about 3 days later, she goes back out. Now, on their property, they have like a little pond. Probably about, I'm going to say, she said about, probably about 100 feet from where the play area at. She said they have a pond back there, and, her and her grandfather, they used to go back there and go fishing. So she said one day she goes, back there at the pond. So she go down there and, she wanted to go fishing. So she get down there, put the bait on the rod. So she throws a rod in. So she said she started, to fish to see if she could catch anything. She said, so while she's standing there trying to see if she can get a bite on her line on the other side of their pond, she said she kept hearing something in the brush, making noise like sticks breaking and leaves and stuff like that. She said, but when she looks over, she don't see nothing. So she brushes off, don't pay it no mind. So after a few minutes, she said she caught her first bite. So she caught the fish, reeled it in, and she put it in the cooler. So she put the bait back on the rod, throws it back in again. So After about 5 minutes, she say she hear that noise again. She said this time when she look over there, she said she could see something. She see a dark shadow moving between the brush. Now she said this brush was about 5 to 5.5 feet tall. So she could see this dark figure moving through the brush. And it's moving north. It's moving north, like up at the tip of the pond. So this thing going that way. And as this thing start to turn and goes north to come around there on the side where she at, the brush stop and it's a open. She said she could see this thing on all fours. She said this thing was huge. She said, but it was built funny. Like the top of it, the front of it was real big and the back was low. She said, but this thing was huge. She said, and it was all black. She said, so this thing is, walking on all fours, coming around like it's coming around to her side. So she drops the rod. She don't take nothing. So she started walking up the trail. So as she's walking up the trail to go back towards the house, she said this thing walks through the woods, but it's still on fours. It's walking through the woods, but it's going in the same direction that she going in. So she started to pick up her pace, she said. So she said when she get to the end of the trail that leads back into their backyard, she said she's walking and she walks up to the back porch, goes up on a porch. She said, and this thing is coming out. Like it's coming out on the right, all the way on the other side of the play area. Said this thing comes out of the tree line and it comes out on all fours. She said, so this thing walks out on all fours in their backyard. She said when this thing walks out on all fours in their backyard, she's watching this thing. So she said she looking at this thing. She said and this thing stopped about 25 feet from the back porch. So she opens her back door. She stands in the back door, but she watching this thing. She said, then this thing turned its head and looked back towards the tree line. That's when she said this thing made this like a popping sound. And this thing like it stretched its back legs, and then this thing stood up. She said, then this thing walked across the property of the backyard and walked it back towards the tree line. She said, when this thing got at the tree line, it turned around and it looked directly at her. It looked directly at her and it stared at her. She said she stood there and she looked at this thing. And she said at one time she couldn't move. It's like she was just stuck. And she stood there. So her grandmother comes out, open the door and comes out and say, why are you standing there? She snaps out of it and say, Ma, don't move, don't say nothing, but look over there at the little path in the tree line. Grandmother looks over there and say, oh my God, what the is that? Now, mind you, she see this thing. This thing is standing up on 2 feet bipedal. She said, and when this grandmother seen this thing, she grabbed the granddaughter and pulled her in the house. They shut the door. The grandmother looks through the curtain of the back of the window in the kitchen, and they looking at this thing. This thing is still standing there. She said, and after about a few minutes, said this thing turned around and it walked back in the tree line down that trail. So her and her granddaughter sitting down trying to contemplate about what is this thing. And the granddaughter said, this ain't the first time I seen this, Grandma. I seen it before. I don't know what it is. She said it looked like a werewolf. So later on that day, when it was just about to get dark, they ate dinner, Granddaughter went upstairs and she said she was in her back room. Now she said while she's in her back room, she's looking out the window. She said while she's looking out this window, she said she had the window cracked a little bit so she could hear. She said at first she could hear insects and all that. She said, but after a few minutes, she said that's when it started to get dead silence, dead quiet. She said you couldn't hear nothing, not even a pin drop. So she said as she's sitting there and she's looking out this window, she said that's when she could see this set of glowing amber color eyes in the woods, up in the tree line. She said, but they not high. She said they low. So she watching these eyes move through the tree line. She saying, why this thing moving through the tree line, these eyes is focused up straight at their house. So she said she watching these eyes. She said, and after this thing walked for about, maybe about 15, 20 feet, said this thing stopped. Said, and when this thing stopped, she said this thing started to growl. This thing was growling, but it was a low growl. But she said she could hear it. She said like she could feel it like in her chest. She said she could like feel this, when this thing growled. So she said she watching this thing. She said that's when this thing walked on all fours down into their yard. Now in their backyard, on the right side of them, they have like a shed. She said this thing walked down to all fours, down where they had this little shed at. She said then this thing stood up. She said this thing stood up on 2 feet again. And when it stood up on 2 feet, she said this thing leaped, jumped, and it jumped on top of this shed. She said this thing was just standing there on top of this shed. And she said she's watching this thing. And as she's watching this thing, she said that's when this thing turned and focused its eyes over at her window. Now this thing watching her. Now she's sitting there and she's saying to herself, how do this thing know that I'm in this window? That's what she trying to figure out. But this thing knew that she was in this window looking at her. So she watching this thing, and this thing just standing there, and it's just watching her. So as this thing was watching her, she said this thing started to growl again. And when this thing growled this time, she said she pulled down that window and pulled down the curtain, and she went in there to her grandparents' room. And they asked her, what's wrong? What's wrong? She said, Grandma and Grandpa, that thing back again, it's out there standing on a little shed. So she said, when this thing was standing on the shed, it looked up at the window at her. She said, I don't know how I knew that I was in the window. So her grandparents, they got up, went in the back. But she said, when they got up, went in the back, they lift up the curtain and looked out the window. They said they could see this dark figure walking across the back of their property in their yard, back up in the tree line. And it just walked it straight up in the woods. Now, that was just, her sighting and her encounters. She said she had plenty more over the summer, but I just wanted to give y'all that, to try to give y'all something to listen to. So I'm gonna try to upload some more, because I do have some more, and I hope y'all like it, and just give me some feedback. Thank you, and good night.